Imagine a vessel of war, a 10,000-ton steel leviathan slicing through the deep blue of the Pacific Ocean at 29 knots. Deep within its armored belly, bolted to the deck and guarded around the clock by United States Army officers, sits a heavy lead cylinder. Inside that cylinder is half of the world's supply of uranium-235. It is the heart of a weapon that will alter the course of human history, a weapon that will bring an empire to its knees and incinerate a city in a fraction of a second. This ship is the tip of the spear of the American military-industrial complex, the chosen courier for the Manhattan Project. Yet, within days of delivering this world-ending cargo, this same mighty warship will be ripped apart in the dark, its crew left to float in a merciless, shark-infested ocean, completely forgotten by the very navy they serve. Welcome back to the channel. I am your host, and today we are conducting a forensic, tactical and strategic autopsy on one of the most catastrophic command, control, and logistical failures in the history of the United States military. We are looking at the sinking of the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis. Before we plot our course into the deadly waters of the Philippine Sea, make sure you hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and sound off in the comments below. Tell me, how does a military machine capable of splitting the atom simultaneously lose track of a flagship carrying 1,200 American sailors? Let us get into the war room and figure it out. To understand the tragedy of the USS Indianapolis, we cannot just look at the torpedo tracks in July of 1945. We have to rewind the clock back to the drafting tables of the 1920s and the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. After the First World War, the major global powers were terrified of another massive naval arms race. They sat down and arbitrarily capped the tonnage and gun caliber of their fleets. For the United States Navy, looking at the absolute massive expanse of the Pacific Ocean, this presented a unique strategic nightmare. They needed ships that could cover thousands of miles of open water, project power, and outgun anything smaller than a battleship, all while staying under the treaty weight limits. The result was the heavy cruiser. The Indianapolis, designated CA-35, was a Portland-class heavy cruiser. Laid down in 1930 and commissioned in 1932, she was a product of compromise. She was built for speed and surface firepower. She measured 610 feet long, with a standard displacement of 9,800 tons. Her propulsion plant was a marvel of the era, boasting 8 White Forster boilers feeding 4 Parsons-geared steam turbines, generating a massive 107,000 shaft horsepower. This gave the Indy a top speed of nearly 33 knots. She was a greyhound of the sea. But speed and firepower came at a severe cost. To keep the weight down, armor protection was minimal by battleship standards. Her main armor belt was a mere 3¼ inches of steel, and her deck armor was just 2½ inches. She was designed to take a punch from an 8-inch shell, but she was fundamentally not designed to survive a massive underwater kinetic event, like a torpedo detonating below the waterline. Furthermore, By 1945, the strategic realities of the Pacific War had drastically altered the ship's center of gravity. Over 3 years of brutal combat, the Navy had relentlessly bolted new technology onto the Indianapolis. They added massive air search radars, fire control directors, and a bristling forest of anti-aircraft artillery to fend off Japanese kamikaze attacks. She carried 24 40mm Bofors guns and 32 20mm Oerlikon cannons. All of this extra steel, lead, and ammunition was placed high above the waterline. The ship was dangerously top-heavy. In rough seas, she rolled like a pendulum, and her damage control margins were razor-thin. If she took on water rapidly, her massive top weight would pull her over. Now, let us look at the strategic context of July 1945. The United States war's machine is running at a terrifying, unprecedented peak of industrial efficiency. The shipyards in California, Washington, and the East Coast are launching destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers faster than the Imperial Japanese Navy can even track them. American military doctrine has shifted from the defensive island hopping of 1942 to total, overwhelming offensive pressure. The Japanese surface fleet is practically non-existent, resting in shattered, rusted heaps at the bottom of the ocean from Midway to Leyte Gulf. The United States controls the air and the sea. The B-29 superfortresses are systematically burning Japanese cities to the ground from their bases in the Marianas. Operation Downfall, the planned amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands, is looming on the horizon, promising a bloodbath of unprecedented scale. But deep in the deserts of New Mexico, a new option had just been successfully tested: the atomic bomb. The logistical challenge was how to get the highly sensitive, incredibly valuable components of the bomb from the United States to the forward bomber base on the island of Tinian. You could not fly it. The aviation technology of the time was too unreliable. If a cargo plane crashed into the ocean, the bomb was lost, and the Manhattan Project would be set back by months. You could not send it on a battleship, because battles were too slow. You could not send it on a destroyer, because destroyers lacked the size, the range, and the stability required for such a sensitive mission. The Navy needed a fast, heavily armed, reliable ship. They chose the USS Indianapolis. The ship had just finished extensive repairs at Hunter's Point in San Francisco after taking a severe kamikaze hit at Okinawa. Her commander was Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, a seasoned combat veteran with a stellar record, descending from a long line of distinguished naval officers. His father had been an admiral. McVeigh was a company man, a tactical realist who understood the brutal mathematics of naval warfare. On July 16, 1945, a heavily guarded convoy arrived at Hunter's Point. A wooden crate containing the uranium projectile and a heavy lead-lined bucket containing the uranium target insert were hoisted aboard the Indianapolis. The bucket was welded to the deck in the flag lieutenant's cabin. Captain McVeigh was not told what the cargo was. He was only told that it was essential to the war effort, that it was to be guarded with lethal force, and that if the ship was sinking, the cargo was to be saved before the crew. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States military apparatus prioritized a heavy metal bucket over the lives of 1,200 American sailors. The Indianapolis cast off and engaged in one of the most phenomenal high-speed transit runs in naval history. She covered the 2,400 miles from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor in just 74.5 hours, averaging 29 knots. She barely slowed down in Hawaii, refueling and immediately tear across the Pacific to Tinian, arriving on July 26. The cargo was offloaded. The mission was a complete success. The weapon that would become Little Boy was safely in the hands of the Army Air Forces. At this point, the crew of the Indianapolis breathed a collective sigh of relief. The secret mission was over. They were ordered to proceed to Guam and then onward to Leyte in the Philippines for 2 weeks of gunnery practice before rejoining Vice Admiral Mark Meacher's Task Force 58 for the invasion of Japan. It is right here in the bureaucratic offices of Naval Command at Guam that the chain of catastrophic failures began to forge its deadly links. When Captain McVeigh arrived in Guam to receive his routing orders for Leyte, he requested an escort. This was standard operating procedure. The Indianapolis was a heavy cruiser. She was a surface brawler. She possessed no sonar system. She was completely blind to underwater threats. In any other phase of the war, a capital ship moving through open water would be screened by at least one, if not two, destroyers equipped with sonar and depth charges. But the routing officer at Guam denied the request. Why would the Navy send a blind capital ship alone across 1,000 miles of ocean? Because complacency is the deadliest weapon on any battlefield. By July 1945, the American command structure had convinced itself that the Philippine Sea was a rear area. It was considered a secure lake. The Japanese surface fleet was gone. Therefore, the threat was deemed negligible. But this was a fatal miscalculation of the enemy's doctrine and desperation. The Imperial Japanese Navy was bleeding to death. But a dying predator is often the most dangerous. While the American industrial base was producing radar-guided anti-aircraft shells and atomic weapons, the Japanese industrial base had collapsed into asymmetric, suicidal warfare. This brings us to the opposing force, the instrument of the Indianapolis's doom. Lurking in the Philippine Sea was the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. Hashimoto was a veteran submariner, a man deeply steeped in the samurai ethos, but also a pragmatic and lethal tactician. The I-58 was a Type B-3 cruiser submarine. She was 344 feet long, displacing over 2,600 tons when submerged. She was powered by twin diesel engines on the surface and electric motors underwater. But her true lethality lay in her armament. She carried 19 Type 95 torpedoes. If you know anything about Pacific naval warfare, you know about the Japanese oxygen torpedoes. While American torpedoes in the early war were plagued by magnetic exploder failures and depth control issues, the Japanese had perfected the oxygen-fueled torpedo. The Type 95 was a smaller submarine-launched variant of the infamous Type 93 Long Lance. It carried a massive 900-pound warhead of Type 97 explosive. Because it used pure oxygen instead of compressed air, it left almost no visible wake on the surface. It was fast, it was silent, and it hit with the force of a freight train. Furthermore, the I-58 was equipped with the ultimate weapon of Japanese desperation, the chiton. These were human torpedoes. Essentially, they were modified Type 93 torpedoes with a cramped cockpit bolted into the center, piloted by a suicide volunteer who would manually steer the explosive into an American ship. Hashimoto had 4 of these chiton strapped to the deck of his submarine. The Japanese doctrine at this stage was no longer about winning the war. It was about bleeding the Americans so severely that they would negotiate a peace treaty. Hashimoto was ordered to patrol the intersection of the routing lanes between Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa. He was hunting for anything that flew the stars and stripes. We must also examine the intelligence failure on the American side. The United States possessed a massive strategic advantage known as Ultra. American codebreakers were reading Japanese naval communications. Naval intelligence in Pearl Harbor and Guam knew that a Japanese submarine, specifically the I-58, was operating in the exact routing lane that the Indianapolis was about to transit. They had intercepted the radio chatter. Yet, this critical piece of intelligence was never passed down to Captain McVeigh. The intelligence officers deemed the information too highly classified to risk distributing to a ship captain, fearing it might compromise the ultra-secret if the ship was captured. They prioritized the security of their intelligence apparatus over the survival of a heavy cruiser. This is a recurring theme in military history. We saw it with the RMS Lusitania in the First World War, where British intelligence knew U-boats were in the area, but failed to adequately warn the unescorted civilian liner. We saw it earlier in the Pacific War with the USS Juno at the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The Juno was torpedoed and sunk in minutes. Because of strict radio silence and command confusion, the surviving fleet sailed away, leaving over 100 men in the water for 8 days. Only 10 survived. The Navy had sworn they learned their lesson about tracking ships and communicating distress. They had implemented a system called the Movement Report System, or MOVREP. But as we are about to see, a system is only as good as the men operating it. On July 28, 1945, the USS Indianapolis steamed out of Apra Harbor, Guam. She was sailing alone. No destroyers, no sonar, just 1,000 miles of deep. Rolling Pacific swells between her and Leyte. The weather was deteriorating, with heavy cloud cover and poor visibility. Captain McVeigh ordered a zigzag course, a standard defensive maneuver designed to throw off the firing solution of a submarine. But as night fell on July 29, the visibility dropped so low that McVeigh deemed zigzagging unnecessary and ordered the ship back to a base course, steaming at a steady 15.7 knots. He went to his cabin to sleep. The ship was quiet. The war felt 1,000,000 miles away. But deep in the black water, just ahead of the cruiser's path, the hydrophone operator aboard the I-58 heard the rhythmic, heavy churning of 4 massive bronze propellers cutting through the sea. The hunter had found its prey, and the crosshairs were beginning to align in the darkness. The acoustic signature of a heavy cruiser moving at nearly 16 knots is unmistakable. Through the earpieces of the Type 93 passive hydrofotor system aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-58, the sound of the USS Indianapolis was a rhythmic, mechanical thumping. It was the sound of 107,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 massive bronze propellers through the dense saltwater of the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto did not need radar. He had the most sensitive acoustic equipment in the Pacific, and the American cruiser was broadcasting its position loudly into the abyss. Hashimoto ordered his boat to periscope depth. The weather was squally, the sky choked with heavy clouds, but in a stroke of catastrophic luck for the Japanese, the clouds suddenly parted. A bright, waning moon illuminated the horizon, backlighting the dark silhouette of the Indianapolis. Hashimoto had a textbook firing solution. At this exact moment, Hashimoto faced a critical tactical choice. Strapped to the deck of his submarine were 4 chiton human torpedoes. The pilots inside those cramped, steel coffins were fanatically begging to be released, eager to die for the emperor. But Hashimoto was a pragmatist. Why rely on a suicide weapon when you have the most advanced conventional torpedo in the world sitting in your forward tubes? The chiton was notoriously unreliable, difficult to steer in the dark, and prone to mechanical failure. A conventional spread of Type 95 oxygen torpedoes, however, was a mathematical certainty. Hashimoto calculated the target speed at 15 knots, the range at a mere 1,500 yards, and the angle on the bow. He ordered a spread of 6 torpedoes to be fired from his forward tubes at 3-second intervals. He fanned the shots out, ensuring that even if the American cruiser detected the launch and attempted an evasive maneuver, she would steer directly into the path of another warhead. At 14 minutes past midnight on July 30, 1945, the firing sequence began. Compressed air blasted the 24-inch diameter steel cylinders out of the tubes. Once clear of the submarine, the torpedo's internal engines ignited. Unlike American torpedoes that left a highly visible trail of white bubbles from compressed air exhaust, the Type 95 burned pure oxygen. It left absolutely no wake. 6 silent, invisible killers were now streaking through the black water at 49 knots, each carrying a 900-pound warhead of Type 97 high explosive. The transit time was less than a minute. Aboard the Indianapolis, there was no warning. No klaxons sounded. No evasive helm orders were given. The crew was entirely oblivious to the lethal geometry closing in on their starboard side. The first torpedo struck the Indianapolis on the starboard bow, just forward of the first 8-inch gun turret. The physics of an underwater explosion against a ship's hull are devastating. It is not just the fire, it is the water hammer effect. The detonation of 900 pounds of hexanitrodiphenylamine and TNT creates a massive, rapidly expanding bubble of superheated gas. This bubble violently punches through the unarmored steel of the lower hull, instantly vaporizing seawater and tearing bulkheads to shreds. The blast literally severed the front 60 feet of the cruiser. Men sleeping in the forward compartments were instantly killed by the concussive force or incinerated by the flash. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo slammed into the cruiser's starboard side, directly amidships below the bridge and the forward magazine. This was the fatal blow. The explosion ignited the ship's aviation fuel bunkers and the powder magazines for the 8-inch guns. A massive pillar of fire shot hundreds of feet into the night sky. The structural integrity of the heavy cruiser was instantly compromised. Her keel, the heavy steel spine of the ship, was broken. We have seen this specific type of catastrophic structural failure before in naval history. When the British battleship HMS Barham was struck by 3 torpedoes from a German U-boat in the Mediterranean in 1941, the massive underwater trauma and subsequent magazine detonation rolled the ship over and sank her in under 4 minutes. A heavy warship is a tightly packed cylinder of explosives, fuel, and high-pressure steam. When that cylinder is violently breached, the chain reaction is unstoppable. How do you fight a fire and seal bulkheads when your ship has just lost all electrical power, the interior communications are severed, and the very deck beneath your feet is tearing itself apart? The brutal answer is that you do not. You abandon ship. But aboard the Indianapolis, the loss of power meant the general alarm could not be sounded. The public address system was dead. Captain Charles McVeigh, thrown from his bunk by the blasts, stumbled onto the bridge only to find thick, toxic smoke and complete chaos. He could not communicate with his engine room. This led to the most horrifying tactical dynamic of the sinking. Because the telegraph lines to the engine room were severed, the massive steam turbines could not be shut down. The Indianapolis was still moving forward at 15 knots, but she no longer had a bow. She was essentially a giant steel scoop, driving thousands of tons of seawater directly into her open wounds with every passing second. This forward momentum acted as a massive shovel, forcing the ship down by the head at a terrifying rate. We saw exactly this phenomenon with the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, where the ship's inability to stop her engines drove her to the bottom of the Celtic Sea in a mere 18 minutes. The Indianapolis was dying even faster. Within 5 minutes, the ship was listing heavily to starboard. The list progressed to 15 degrees, then 30 degrees. Below decks, the situation was a pitch-black, burning hell. Men scrambled through twisting, smoke-filled corridors, tripping over the dead and dying, trying to reach the topside hatches. The emergency lighting had failed. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of cordite, burning electrical wire, and vaporized fuel oil. Topside, the severe list made it impossible to launch the heavy wooden lifeboats. They were hopelessly pinned to the deck by gravity. The crew was forced to rely on floater nets, small rubber rafts, and the standard-issue kapok life jackets. These life jackets, filled with buoyant kapok tree fibers, were designed to keep a man afloat for perhaps 48 hours. They were never intended for a prolonged, multi-day survival scenario. As the list hit 60 degrees, the ship's massive anti-aircraft guns and radar equipment, the very top weight that made her so unstable, began to tear loose from their mounts, crushing men as they slid across the deck. Captain McVeigh passed the order to abandon ship by word of mouth, but hundreds of men never received it. At 26 minutes past midnight, just 12 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the USS Indianapolis rolled completely over. Her stern rose high into the night air, the 4 massive bronze propellers still slowly turning in the moonlight. Then she plunged straight down, sinking into the Marianas Trench, taking approximately 300 American sailors with her to the bottom. 900 men were left floating in the dark, churning waters of the Philippine Sea. They were covered in thick, viscous bunker C fuel oil that had hemorrhaged from the ship's ruptured tanks. This oil was toxic. It burned their eyes, blinded them, and caused severe vomiting when swallowed. They were scattered over miles of ocean in small, disorganized groups, clinging to debris, ammunition boxes, and each other. But surely a distress signal had been sent. Surely the most powerful navy in the world would immediately realize one of its capital ships was missing and launch a massive search and rescue operation. This is where the tactical failure of the sinking transitions into a strategic and bureaucratic failure of epic proportions. The ship's main radio room was destroyed in the initial blast, but a group of dedicated radio operators managed to patch together a backup transmitter. They tapped out a frantic SOS, detailing their coordinates, and that they had been torpedoed. This signal was actually received. It was picked up by 3 separate United States Navy receiving stations, one in Leyte, one in Tolosa, and one in Okinawa. What happens when the fail-safes designed to protect American lives are manned by officers who are too tired, too arrogant, or too complacent to do their jobs? The men in the water pay the ultimate price. At the Leyte station, the commander was reportedly drunk and ignored the message. At the Tolosa station, the commander had left strict orders not to be disturbed, and his subordinates simply filed the SOS away. At the Okinawa station, the intelligence officers intercepted the message, but arrogantly dismissed it as a Japanese trick, a fake transmission designed to lure American rescue ships into a submarine ambush. The distress calls were completely ignored. No rescue was launched. No one even bothered to check the routing board to see that the Indianapolis was indeed in that exact sector. As the sun rose on the morning of July 30th, the true horror of the situation began to dawn on the 900 survivors. The air temperature soared to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The water temperature was a seemingly warm 85 degrees, but prolonged exposure to water below human body temperature inevitably leads to hypothermia. The men were already exhausted, dehydrated, and violently ill from swallowing fuel oil. They looked out at the empty, endless horizon, waiting for the planes and ships that were never coming. And then the surface of the water began to break. The initial explosions, the frantic thrashing of 900 men, and the blood from the wounded had sent a massive acoustic and olfactory shockwave through the ocean. It drew the attention of the apex predator of the open ocean, the oceanic white-tip shark. The first dorsal fins began to circle the edges of the largest group, cutting silently through the slick of black oil, signaling the beginning of the most sustained and deadly shark attack in recorded human history. The oceanic whitetip is not a coastal predator, but a pelagic scavenger, an opportunistic killer perfectly adapted to the barren deserts of the deep ocean. When a ship sinks, the low-frequency acoustic shockwaves and the sudden, massive slick of blood and biological waste act as a dinner bell that can be detected for miles. The first attacks were clinical and terrifyingly silent. The sharks targeted the dead and the bleeding first, pulling them beneath the surface with a sudden, violent thrashing that left only a cloud of crimson in the black water. But as the first day bled into the second, the predators grew bolder. They began to bump the living, testing their prey. If a sailor panicked and thrashed, he was marked. The men quickly realized that survival required absolute, paralyzing stillness, a near impossible task when you are treading water in an oil slick, surrounded by the screams of your shipmates being dragged into the abyss. How does the human mind comprehend being hunted from below while baking from above, entirely abandoned by the military apparatus you just served? The answer is that the mind simply breaks. By the third day, August 1, 1945, the primary killer was no longer the sharks, but the sun and the salt. The equatorial sun beat down relentlessly, pushing the ambient air temperature well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The glare reflecting off the water and the thick bunker sea fuel oil caused severe photophobia, literally burning the sailors' corneas and rendering many of them temporarily blind. Dehydration became a physiological torture. The human body requires fresh water to process sodium. When a desperate, delirious sailor finally gave in and drank the ocean water, a lethal biological chain reaction called hypernatremia began. The massive influx of salt forced the body to pull water out of its own cells, including brain cells, to dilute the sodium. Within hours, the men who drank the seawater descended into violent, hallucinatory madness. They believed the Indianapolis was floating just beneath the surface, fully intact, with cold water fountains running in the galley. They dove down to get a drink, never to return. Others, gripped by paranoid delusions, believed their fellow sailors were Japanese infiltrators. Men who had survived kamikaze attacks and torpedo blasts ended up drawing their survival knives and murdering each other in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The logistical failure of the standard issue American survival gear was now fully exposed. The kapok life jackets, filled with buoyant plant fibers, were officially rated to keep a man afloat for 48 hours. As the ordeal stretched into its third and fourth days, the kapok became entirely waterlogged. The life jackets that were supposed to save these men slowly transformed into heavy, sodden anchors, dragging exhausted sailors beneath the waves. The few wooden rafts that had floated free were overcrowded, leading to brutal Darwinian struggles for space. The United States Navy, a force that prided itself on logistical supremacy, had left its men to rot in a high-tech, industrial-age war, reduced to the most primitive, brutal state of nature imaginable. It is here we must draw a stark historical comparison to understand the sheer scale of this institutional complacency. We saw this exact same deadly arrogance during the cure of 1944 in the Ardennes forest, leading up to the Battle of the Bulge. American commanders, looking at maps in comfortable headquarters, deemed the Ardennes a quiet sector, a ghost front. They ignored multiple intelligence reports of German panzer divisions massing in the woods, believing the enemy was completely defeated. That complacency cost thousands of American lives. The naval commanders in Guam and the Philippines treated the Philippine Sea with the exact same lethal hubris. Because the Japanese surface fleet was destroyed, they assumed the waters were a secure American lake, completely ignoring the asymmetric threat of the I-58 and the intercepted ultra-intelligence. In both the Ardennes and the Philippine Sea, the bureaucracy failed the men on the front lines, choosing comfortable assumptions over hard, tactical realities. The salvation of the Indianapolis survivors was not the result of a coordinated Navy search and rescue operation. It was a complete, blind accident. On the morning of August 2, 1945, day 4 of the ordeal, Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn was flying a twin-engine PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol. He was not looking for survivors. He was crawling toward the back of his aircraft to fix a trailing wire antenna that had snapped. As he looked down through a blister window to check the wire, he saw a massive oil slick trailing across the ocean surface. Assuming he had found a damaged Japanese submarine, Gwynn ordered his pilot to drop down for an attack run. As the Ventura descended to 300 feet, the bomb bay doors open. Gwynn looked through his sights and realized with horror that the debris field was not a submarine. It was hundreds of men, covered in oil, waving frantically at the sky. Gwynn immediately broke radio silence and transmitted a frantic message to his base at Peleliu, reporting men in the water. The Navy bureaucracy, still completely unaware that the Indianapolis was missing, assumed these were survivors of a downed aircraft. They dispatched a PBY Catalina flying boat, commanded by Lieutenant R. Adrian Marks, to investigate. When Marks arrived over the coordinates, he witnessed a scene of absolute carnage. He saw sharks actively attacking the stragglers on the edges of the group. Against standing orders that forbade open ocean landings in heavy swells, Marks made a tactical decision that saved dozens of lives. He stalled the massive Catalina into the 12-foot swells, violently bouncing off the waves, popping rivets and tearing holes in the fuselage, but keeping the aircraft upright. Marks and his crew began taxiing around the debris field, physically pulling the most critically wounded men into the plane. When the fuselage was full, they began tying men to the wings with parachute cord. Marks single-handedly pulled 56 men out of the shark-infested waters. As night fell on August 2nd, the vanguard of the surface rescue fleet finally arrived. The destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle, commanded by Captain W. Graham Claytor, reached the area. In a bold tactical move that deliberately violated wartime blackout protocols, Claytor ordered his crew to point the destroyer's massive 24-inch searchlight directly into the night sky. That solitary beam of light, bouncing off the cloud cover, served as a beacon of hope for the men still drifting in the dark, letting them know that the United States Navy had finally found them. Over the next 24 hours, a flotilla of destroyers and hospital ships converged on the coordinates, pulling the last of the living from the water. Out of the 1,195 men who had sailed from Guam, only 316 survived. 879 American sailors were dead. The vast majority lost not to the torpedoes, but to the elements, the sharks, and the unforgivable negligence of their own command structure. When the sheer magnitude of the disaster reached Washington, the political and public relations machinery of the Department of the Navy went into overdrive. They had a catastrophic scandal on their hands. A heavy cruiser lost, intelligence ignored, distress signals dismissed, and hundreds of boys eaten by sharks because of a broken routing system. How does a military bureaucracy handle a failure of this magnitude? They bury it under a larger victory, and they find a scapegoat. The Navy deliberately withheld the press release of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis until August 15, 1945. This was the exact same day that President Harry Truman announced the unconditional surrender of the Japanese Empire to the world. The deaths of nearly 900 men were intentionally buried under the ticker tape parades, the kissing sailors in Times Square, and the euphoria of VJ Day. It was a masterclass in political spin and information control. But the bureaucracy still needed someone to blame. They could not admit that the movement report system was fundamentally flawed, or that officers in Leyte were drinking on duty and ignoring SOS calls. They set their sights on Captain Charles B. McVeigh. In December 1945, McVeigh was court-martialed, charged with hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. This was a stunning, unprecedented legal maneuver. To ensure a conviction, the United States Navy brought Mochitsura Hashimoto, the commander of the Japanese submarine I-58, to Washington, D.C., to testify against an American captain. Hashimoto, an enemy combatant who had just weeks earlier been trying to kill Americans, explicitly testified that zigzagging would have made absolutely no difference, because his firing solution was perfect and the oxygen torpedoes were too fast. Despite this testimony, and despite the fact that nobody in the Navy had informed McVeigh of the submarine threat, the court found him guilty. We must look at the aftermath of Pearl Harbor to understand this institutional behavior. Following the devastating surprise attack in 1941, the military establishment needed to deflect blame from Washington's intelligence failures. They targeted Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, stripping him of his rank and destroying his career to protect the institution. Captain McVeigh was subjected to the exact same bureaucratic crucifixion. He was made to carry the guilt of the entire Navy. For decades, McVeigh received hate mail from the families of the dead sailors accusing him of murdering their sons. The psychological weight was unbearable. In 1968, on his front lawn in Litchfield, Connecticut, Captain Charles McVeigh put his service pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, becoming the final casualty of the USS Indianapolis. He was holding a toy wooden sailor in his hand when he died. It was not until the year 2000, after a relentless campaign by a middle school student named Hunter Scott and the surviving crew members, that the United States Congress finally passed a resolution exonerating Captain McVeigh, a hollow victory delivered half a century too late. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis remains the worst disaster at sea in the history of the United States Navy. It is a story that encompasses the absolute pinnacle of human technological achievement, the atomic bomb, and the absolute lowest depths of bureaucratic incompetence and primal suffering. It proves that in warfare, the most dangerous enemy is rarely the one looking at you through a periscope. The most dangerous enemy is the complacency of your own command, the failure of your own logistics, and the arrogance of a system that forgets the human cost of its grand strategy. The ocean does not care about your secret missions. It does not care about your atomic weapons, and it certainly does not care about your excuses. That brings us to the end of this tactical autopsy. Now, I want to hear your assessment in the comments below. Which failure do you believe was the most unforgivable in the tragedy of the USS Indianapolis? Is it A, the routing command denying a destroyer escort for a blind capital ship? Is it B, the intelligence officers ignoring the SS distress signals and the ultra intercepts? Or is it C, the Navy's political cover-up and the shameful court-martial of Captain McVeigh? Drop your vote in the comments. Let us debate the tactics. And I will see you in the next war room.